thanks everyone for joining us today for this special LGRU Australia conversation. For those that aren't aware of LGRU, it's a body that's working across Australia and the UK to collectively make local governments stronger, sharing ideas, resources, and tackling some really big issues of today's local government and those into the future. Across the month of March, LGRU Australia is having a special focus on local government financial sustainability. And I'm joined today with Dr. Marcus Spiller, who will be presenting why we need financially strong local governments and how we might get there. Before we start into the launch of the presentation, I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations people of which we're filming this conversation from today, and pay my respects to First Nations people both past and present, and acknowledge their stewardship of country over thousands of years. Today, I'm coming from the beautiful Gadigal land up in Sydney, and Marcus, you're coming to us from Wurundjeri land. Is it boiling hot or freezing cold in Naarm today?
It's just perfect.
Beautiful. So you're going to give us a presentation from around about 18 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion around financial sustainabilities of local government. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, whatever time you're watching this video. I'm going to just bring up my presentation now and take you through it. I want to address 6 topics briefly in this presentation. One is just to remind us all of just how important local government is to the Australian way of life, to our collective aspirations for a sustainable, inclusive and prosperous society. I then want to talk about the fact that the record suggests that councils are actually good with money, that they are good financial managers, but notwithstanding their skill and care in that space, they are struggling financially. And that's the third topic I'll cover. In terms of thinking about how we redress this situation, I want to introduce 3 conceptual ideas for reforming local government finance. That's the 4th topic. I then want to address how we might move towards those 3 ideals in the 5th stanza of my presentation. And then I want to talk about what the payoff for the nation is were we to put local government on a more sound financial footing. What is the business case for reform in this space? So as this audience will know full well, local government has a very broad scope. Its service offer spans a very wide range of environmental, economic and community services, all of which are treasured by our local communities. In fact, in many ways, local government has greater contact with our citizens than either state or Commonwealth government. And the services that local government provide has a material impact on productivity, on the strength of our economy, which I'll return to a little later in this presentation. Very importantly, local government plays a key role in Australia's system of governance because it is place-based. Our national government and our state governments do good work, of course. We rely on them for key services, but because they need to deliver their services at scale to a largely uniform or consistent standard across large geographies, they tend to work in silos. So, you know, you have your education departments, your law departments, your health departments and so forth that must work in large bureaucracies, tapping economies of scale. Local government is quite different from that. Local government gets its power not from economies of scale, but from economies of scope, the ability to bring together a blend of services in a place to improve people's lives by making connections. This is something that only local government can do. only local government is competent to do. So local councils and this sphere of governance is really important, and there is good evidence to show that councils are good with money. So some of people in the audience may have seen some of these statistics before, but it shows that in terms of government per capita expenditure, there's been strong growth at both the Commonwealth and the state level, whereas for local government, for various reasons, it's remained fairly static. But even though local government is working with a smaller or shrinking pool of resources, surveyed satisfaction with local government is comparatively high with councils. So you can see in that little chart in the top right there that 75% of people are okay or really happy with the way that their council works, compared with only 65% of Australian government when people are quizzed about the Australian government. So even though councils are working with a smaller pool of money, they are delivering good value. This is a sign of good financial management because they're getting the best outcomes out of the limited resources available to them. Notwithstanding their skill and care, councils are struggling financially. This means that they're struggling due to factors beyond their control. So we see that more than 50% of councils across the country are not raising enough revenue from their own sources to meet their operating costs. Almost half of all councils can't renew their own assets based on their financial resources, and the financial performance across the sector has deteriorated over the past 5 years. Only 1 in 5 councils, only 20% of councils score well on the trifecta of operating surplus, debt service and asset renewal ratios. And we're finding, sadly, in many parts of the country that access to basic local government services is at risk. So if we want to move from this precarious situation and allow councils to create even more value than what they're doing right now for their communities, we need a framework for thinking about it. And here are 3 core principles for moving local government onto a sounder financial footing. The first one is fiscal autonomy. This is the idea that local governments should be treated genuinely as a sphere of government and should have its own independent income stream based on decisions that it makes in response to local ratepayers, local voters, about how they go about taxation. So they need their own tax base, which is not open to interference from state and Commonwealth government, but is a matter for, shall we say, electoral negotiation through the democratic process. The second principle is that of fiscal equalisation. This is recognising that some councils, notwithstanding their skill, their commitment and their care, have disabilities when it comes to revenue raising owing to factors well beyond their control. For example, they may have a sparse population in a very large area. So we find that in regional areas. They may be councils that have been having to endure structural economic change, so that core industries have dwindled and the rate base has shrunk as a result. And they may have other disabilities in terms of revenue raising. The fiscal equalisation principle says that it is the responsibility of the wider community, that is the Australian and state community, to top up the revenues of those councils so that all citizens everywhere have access to a reasonable minimum standard of local government services. And the third principle is that of subsidiarity. This is the idea that levels of government should stick to what they are best at, what they're competent in. So local matters should be dealt with by local government. National matters should be dealt with by the Commonwealth Parliament and executive government, things like defence and trade and international treaties. And the state government should look after those matters that are best handled at a statewide level. For example, your education, health services, policing services and so forth. The subsidiarity principle really frowns upon Commonwealth and state governments meddling in local affairs because they simply are not competent to make wise decisions in that regard. It's in some ways outrageous that, for example, a Commonwealth government should decide which footy clubs should get change rooms and which ones wouldn't. They simply don't have the knowledge to make the right choices there. I won't dwell on these next few slides too much. They simply point out that across those three principles, we're not doing that well at present. So on fiscal autonomy, we find that a large proportion of councils are finding it difficult to raise the revenue that they need, that they are reliant on external sources of finance which are beyond their control. So it makes planning and financial management more difficult. And as alluded to earlier, local government revenue has increased at a snail's pace compared to revenues for the Commonwealth and the state. In terms of fiscal equalisation, we've had a kind of aspiration for decades now that the Commonwealth would provide 1% of all outlays in financial assistance grants to councils. But what we find is that in broad terms, that proportional level has been sliding over the decades. And not only that, it has been very erratic or volatile, which again works against planning and good financial management on the part of councils. And in terms of subsidiarity, I offered a couple of anecdotes a moment ago, but what we do see is that Commonwealth and state governments ever more meddling, if you like, in local government matters using tied and competitive grants. So what needs to change? What's the way forward in bringing our system closer to those three principles that I outlined? This is not exactly a strategy yet. It obviously needs more meat on the bones, but to get the conversation going, I think we can think about 6 strategic directions. One is to be clearer about the division of responsibilities between the spheres of government, so that we don't have this blurring of accountabilities and responsibilities that we tend to see in Australia. So let's have a documented agreement about the scope of what local government should be allowed to do independently. In New South Wales and Victoria, of course, we have quite a direct impediment on fiscal autonomy through rate pegging and rate capping. It's been in place for decades in the case of New South Wales and for a good 20 odd years or more in Victoria now. It's difficult to immediately lift rate capping. Politically, we must accept, I think, that that's a difficult thing to do, but it could be possible and would be possible and should happen that we move towards putting the cap in the first instance in the hands of a more technical body rather than a political forum, such as occurs more or less these days in New South Wales, and then looking in the longer run to removing the cap altogether. It is important to recommit to lifting Commonwealth financial assistance grants to 1% of total outlays. This is something that all parties should be able to commit to. It is about shoring up the ability of councils to deliver basic services right across the country, and that's a fundamental equity principle that we should be able to sign up to. As well as allowing councils freer rein over their existing tax bases, notably property rates, we should also perhaps be thinking about expanding the revenue base of local government so that part of the uplift in land value that occurs as a result of planning, zoning, infrastructure provision comes back to councils to help pay for infrastructure and services. At the moment, only one jurisdiction has this, and that's the ACT, which, as a result of its leasehold tenure system, the ACT government does in fact gain 75% of the uplift in land value upon the granting of planning permits. That principle could be applied in those jurisdictions with freehold titles quite readily. It hasn't happened to date, but there is an important potential source of revenue there, baseload revenue there for local government if we put our minds to it. Perhaps we also need to look at the Grants Commission guidelines and methodology in terms of how financial assistance grants and grants generally are distributed across councils. There is a great diversity amongst councils. Some councils, particularly inner city and capital city councils, even though they have a broader set of responsibilities providing services for broader catchments, are on a much sounder financial footing, partly as a result of revenue sources that are beyond the reach of suburban and regional and rural councils, for example, parking revenues. So there could be a case for radically reviewing redistribution policies so that more of the available funds go to suburban, regional and rural councils. And there needs to be support for councils to innovate in revenue raising. Councils, because they're place-based, often can see opportunities to build businesses or tap revenue sources that may not be obvious to state governments or Commonwealth governments. Things around, for example, utilising land that the council might own, or leveraging various council facilities to generate resources, revenue, for example, access to council-owned office buildings or community facilities. So were we to move towards those three pillars of a more sustainable local government, what would be the payoff for the country? I mean, we know that it would be good for local communities because councils have proven themselves to be good with money and good with delivering services. But if we take a kind of helicopter view and see what would be the benefits for Australia as a whole, we would expect to see saved vehicle operating costs on better maintained roads, health cost savings as a result of local councils making better use or being able to produce a better public domain, public open space, parkland, facilities for people to engage in exercise and so forth. So we'd expect to see health cost savings there and a more fit and healthy workforce, which also provides a productivity boost. We'd expect to see faster and better decision making on things like planning and building. Quite often we hear that from developers that the problem isn't so much the planning scheme or the rules per se, but the fact that councils are constrained in terms of the staff that they have to deal with applications before them. We'd expect to see saved administrative costs in councils having to go through the hoops when they're pitching for grants, competitive grants from the state and the Commonwealth government, and having to dedicate administrative resources to track the expenditure on these tied grants and so on. This is red tape that local governments really don't need. And because they would be on a stronger financial footing, we would expect local government to save on workforce recruitment and retention because turnover we would expect to be less. So there are many benefits. Do these benefits warrant the investment in putting local governments on a sounder financial footing? We at SGS have done some modelling on this. Of course, to achieve these outcomes doesn't necessarily require governments to spend money. A lot of these benefits can be generated simply by re-engineering intergovernment financial relations, so that, for example, we have a clearer subsidiarity-based allocation of functions. This doesn't require the spending of money; it requires clarification of roles. But it would require, as I've discussed, a lift in financial assistance grants and other resource top-ups, which we estimate to be somewhere between the cost to the state and Commonwealth governments would be around $1 to $2 billion a year. The modelling that we've done suggests that once local government is placed on a more efficient footing and able to do its job better, the productivity gain to the overall economy would be of the order of $7 billion per year. That is a boost to GDP that otherwise wouldn't occur to the tune of $7 billion. And roughly $1.7 billion of that $7 billion boost in GDP would flow to the Commonwealth in additional income tax and corporate tax revenues. So part of the deal here is that helping to put local government on a sounder financial footing is actually a cost-free exercise for the Commonwealth. It would get back whatever it would outlay in terms of improving the financial footing of local governments. It would get that back by way of additional tax revenues. So I'll leave it at that, Jo, for now, I think.
Thanks, Marcus. I mean, lots of really interesting stats there. I mean, this LGIU is obviously across Australia. Are all councils across Australia financially vulnerable, do you think?
No, I think, as I briefly mentioned, roughly 20% of councils are, shall we say, in a quote-unquote comfortable situation when it comes to financial performance, being able to meet their operating costs and renew assets and have adequate debt servicing. They tend to be in the more in the country's economic hotspots, which tend to be in the central city areas of our major metropolises. So it would be wrong to say that all councils are vulnerable, but the stats suggest that the numbers of councils that are joining those that are vulnerable is inching upwards.
Yeah, great. I mean, and we're seeing that through our work that we do with local governments across Australia, where especially in those kind of regional and rural areas where they have a much lower rate base in terms of where they would get most of their revenue, they struggle to get that because of the rate base, but they also have lower access to grants that you might see in an area or a growth area. And they often don't have the resources either to kind of be able to go for those grants. So that kind of point that you made around having untied grants is really important, especially for our regional and rural councils as well.
Yeah, and it is. Look, these tied grants are cruel in other ways that perhaps aren't immediately obvious. So because it's an opportunity to get some extra revenue, it can actually distort the decision-making of councils that have got limited revenues to begin with. So they might divert resources from what they would regard ordinarily as more pressing community needs, just to give themselves a chance at getting these grants. And so it curiously, in those admittedly more extreme situations, those grants, which are perhaps offered by Commonwealth and state governments with a view to improving local community outcomes, could actually be working against the best community outcomes. Yeah,
correct. And they're often only for capital, not for operational.
Yes,
so you see the ongoing capital challenges with that as well. The other graph that I quite liked in there was around that kind of stable line on the per capita spend for local governments. We know that councils are delivering more and more services. I mean, you had a great list at the start there, but that's continually often increasing, either through shifting from different governments, which you also talked about in terms of roles and responsibilities, or because community need. I mean, they have a range of services which are either mandated to do by either legislation or as a core local government service. And then sometimes they might be delivering kind of optional services which they might deliver for 6 months or 5 years, kind of depending on community need. What do you see as some of the big community and economic impacts of this kind of decreasing or financial vulnerability of local governments?
Well, look, I think there's, I mentioned in the talk that in terms of the intersection between the citizens' life and governments, local government is probably there every day that you walk out the door, you're intersecting with something that your local council is doing or has done. So that's not to diminish the importance of the roles of state and Commonwealth government, but they tend to be in the big ticket items more episodic, shall we say, in your life. You go through your schooling years and you might have to use a hospital, etc., etc. But local government is a surround sound thing. It's always there, and to have a diminished ability to offer those services does impact quality of life in a very serious way. In many ways, if the Commonwealth and the state really focused on the citizen in place and leveraged the insights that local government has, it's a no-brainer to put local government on a sound of financial footing, because the impact of that is enormous. Perhaps it's not as exciting from a political point of view as having big ribbon-cutting projects, but it's as I say, a structural part of our well-being. So we have done some research to show that in some parts of the country, really treasured local government services are being pared back. One important one, and I know that you're interested in this stuff, Jo, is libraries. They are so important in quality of life in various stages of life in many communities, but we're finding that more and more councils are struggling to keep those services going. And if they do keep them going, they have to pare back on really important other programs like keeping the roads intact. So yes, they're in a cruelly difficult situation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're seeing that lots of councils are now making service reviews as a core piece of their work, which I think they should do from a best practice perspective. But they're really starting to find really small kind of savings that they can make either through their service delivery and making it more efficient and effective, but also looking at the private market and what could the private market or the not-for-profit market kind of do and fill those gaps. Again, our regional rural councils are probably more at a loss there, where they don't have the other market share that they can potentially work on. So they are generally the provider of last resort. I mean, the other thing that we're starting to see is potentially we're having a greater reliance on the private sector for our essential infrastructure. Any thoughts on that in terms of potential challenges or risks that could push?
So we are seeing, I mean, it has been the story of, in a sense, the past 40 years, trying to leverage private capital to deliver community services. By community services, I mean the full spectrum, from roads through to courthouses, through to performing arts centres and so forth. And there's no doubt about it that private capital can be leveraged through public-private partnerships, but we should not ever allow ourselves to believe that it's a cost-free or magic situation, because you do lose control. You perhaps forego a degree of responsiveness to ratepayer needs. One little example of this is outsourcing of parks and gardens maintenance. Can look good on paper. You can perhaps shave a small proportion of the costs, but when it comes to the things that really make a difference to ratepayer lives, like, for example, having a bough removed when it's fallen in a storm, when you can get a council crew to go out and do it, instead of saying, well, we'll put in a request to our private contractor and it might be gone in 2 weeks' time, these things really stick in the minds of the citizen, and they don't, and rightly resist the idea that their local council can't be more responsive. And the other thing to bear in mind is that that lack of control on the part of councils can in fact diminish their skill set and the robustness and the continuity of service provision in a place. And so, there have been documented studies done of where contracting out has, in the end, wound up costing councils more because they've lost the capacity, if you like, to provide those services themselves. And so they become a captive. They become captive to the contractor. That's probably being a little dramatic, but those dangers are certainly to be considered.
Yeah. I mean, this time of year, there's always lots of commentary around the value of the local government sector and rate increases. We're seeing this recently with Sydney Council hitting a lot of the front pages of the paper. As professionals, you and I love the local government sector. Probably should have put that bias up front for this podcast. But what role do people like us have and others that are in this sector in terms of supporting local government?
Well, I think the big challenge, part of the theme of my talk is to just remind even people within the sector just how important it is, not only to the day-to-day well-being of our citizens. As I said before, it's a surround sound kind of part of government that you walk out the door and you're immediately in contact with what local government does. But I'm also convinced that having strong local government means a more productive Australia. So, you talk to the Productivity Commission and they say all the problems we have in our country can ultimately be boiled down to a productivity crisis, that we need as a nation to get more out of the resources that we've got, including our human capital. Well, what I think we need to demonstrate and keep providing the evidence for is that local government is a untapped source of productivity growth for our nation. And I pointed out in the slide, health cost savings, transportation cost savings, these all mount up to a benefit of $7 billion a year. So I think, making the economic case for stronger local government is part of our mission.
Yeah, well said. And final question for you, do you have hope for the local government sector?
I have more faith than I have hope. No, look, I absolutely do. I mean, it's very clear, isn't it, that when local government or the continuity of local government is put at risk, or when disasters hit communities, it's very clear that people, we're Australians, we like to complain a little bit about government. It seems to be in our DNA, but it seems to me that people really are attached to their local governments. They don't like them to be pushed around too much. They do know that, when times are tough, they are often on the front line. So I've got great faith and hope that local government's got a bright future in our country, but we do need to structurally reform it. And I don't mean changing local governments per se through amalgamations and the like. In fact, I think that debate may have run its course. I'm thinking more in terms of the way in which as creatures of the state, how the state and the Commonwealth can make structural financial reforms so that local governments can be let to do the good work that they demonstrably do.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Marcus, and thanks for those listening. So as a reminder, this is an LGIU event. If you want to know more about LGIU Australia and the resources that you can access, jump online and check them out. Catch you next time.